Hello. This is the lecture for Digestive System. So I already did a lab portion, a series of lectures and pointed out models and everything. I'm not going to go into all the same detail that I went over in lab, but a lot of that stuff you still have to know. So for instance, here in the mouth, you have to know that what the epiglottis's function is. I'm not going to ever, give you a model. I'm not going to show you a picture in the lecture test. I'm not going to show you a thing to label. That's all lab. But you do have to know, what salivary glands do and what the soft palate does and the different kinds of teeth and, the same basic stuff that I taught you guys in lab, including all the way through here. So what I'll do is I'll follow, today I'll follow the food as it progresses down from your mouth up there, down through your esophagus into your stomach, moves along through the small intestine, gets stuff squirted on it from the liver and the pancreas, ends up into the large intestine, and it's processed. And when we move over to the whiteboard over here, there's going to be a lot of physiological terms. So take that information that you learned in the lab portion and bring it with you in here. So watch that video again before you take a test. But just know that I'm not going to say, name this thing for the lecture. That's something I'll do for the lab. And in lab, I'm not going to ask you to name specific functions of a lot of different enzymes, but I'm probably going to do that in here. All right, so let's move over to the board. Here we are.
The other picture?
What about it?
The other picture or no?
This one?
Yeah.
That I already put up.
Oh, you're right.
Hey, I'm the talent. You stay behind the camera, pal. Whoever you are, random person. All right, Brian. So here we are. I'm starting in the mouth, and I'm going to work my way down. I've kind of numbered them because I kind of put them out of order down there. You'll see. So when we get a big picture later of it, the numbers tell you which sequence I went through them in. So inside of the mouth, you're going to do, there's this different there's different stages of digestion. You have ingestion and mechanical digestion and chemical digestion and propulsion and all those things that I covered in lab. Yes, know those again. So your teeth are chewing it up and you're squirting saliva all over this food the whole time, right? So you put a hamburger, you take a bite of a hamburger, you put it in there, you smush it up, and by the time you've chewed it and masticated it and squirted saliva all over it, it's probably pretty gross. You probably wouldn't want to look at it. Like if you had to put it out in your hand and put it back in your mouth, then you might hesitate. Even though it's in your mouth, you're probably going to swallow it. But your saliva does a few things for you. It's mucus, so it produces mucus, so it'll lubricate, and it's real watery. It produces an enzyme called amylase, which when you see that one, amylase digests starch. So if you put, there's an experiment that you can supposedly run where you put a cracker in your mouth and let it sit there for 10 minutes and it becomes sweet. I'm not going to let a cracker get mushy in my mouth that long, so I'll never know. But it'll break it down into sugar. Lysozyme, you may have heard this one before. That's an enzyme that kills bacteria, so you've got a protective function to the saliva as well. Immunoglobulin A, so that's antibody A, that class A antibody. They find that one, so it's going to be able to recognize, identify pathogens, specific pathogens, and you make about 1.5 liters a day. Most of this you just swallow. So every time even if you're not eating, if you just swallow, you're swallowing a couple of mils or a mil or whatever of saliva. So that's going to add up. I'm just going to kind of keep track of it to show you how much water you have to reabsorb. All right, you swallow, goes down the esophagus. We learned about the esophagus in lab, and that food enters the stomach. Know the different sphincters from the stomach again. Your stomach's volume, that's what I'm representing here. Empty, you've got about 50 mils of space, and 50 milliliters is really small. It's like, I think it's like a shot, maybe. Like if you picture a shot glass, it's probably in that ballpark. I don't really for sure. So it's kind of collapsed in really a small volume. But it can go up to 4 liters. So those competitive eaters that you see can really stretch that stomach, and the stomach's got this amazing ability to be elastic and stretch out. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. They're inside of your stomach. You're going to find what look to be in the walls of it little holes. That if you were looking at the inside of the stomach, it would look like that. There'd be these big ribbons, these rugae, if you remember those. But then there's these little things, and if you looked at them from a side view, they'd kind of go like this. And these are what are called gastric pits. And inside of the gastric pits, you'll find a lot of glandular tissue. So those different types of glandular tissue actually in those pits as well. So in one pit, you'll have several different types. There are cells called mucus neck cells, which produce an acidic mucus. You have parietal cells, which will also produce an acid. They produce hydrochloric acid. Hydrochloric acid is, we often think of our stomach being this kind of chemical digestion organ, and it does do some, but it's mostly storage and decontamination, right? So hydrochloric acid is going to be a real toxic and real lethal to a lot of bacteria. Then you also produce something called intrinsic factor, which aids in vitamin B absorption. You have cells that are called chief cells, and their main contribution here is something called pepsinogen. And anytime you see when you see this ogen, it's either going to cause something to form or it's the precursor. In this case, pepsinogen is the precursor to a molecule called pepsin. When pepsinogen is exposed to hydrochloric acid, it becomes pepsin. And pepsin is a protein digesting enzyme. So you do have some chemical digestion of proteins in your stomach, largely because of pepsin. You do produce a few lipases, and lipase breaks down lipids. Additionally, you've got cells called enteroendocrine cells. This is a big word, enteroendocrine. You'll see them again in the intestine. Enteroendocrine cells produce a lot of digestion promoting molecules, I guess, like paracrines. You remember the term paracrines? So they're going to be chemicals that help the other cells nearby do their jobs. And then lastly, just a little volume sum here. You make about 3 liters per day of gastric juice. So you're pumping out a lot of juice into that lumen of your stomach. Still in the stomach here, going up here, there are 3 basic phases to activity in the stomach. There is what's called the cephalic phase, and cephalic means head. So this is literally involves your head. If you see food or think about food or smell food, right? You've smelled food before when you're hungry, or you could eat, but then you smell something really good and you're like, I'm starving, right? So that's like kind of the idea behind this cephalic phase. If you're preparing to eat, it's good to get your stomach geared up. So during the cephalic phase, your stomach begins to get a little motile. You might hear noises like that. It starts to produce some mucus and stuff. Now the gastric phase is when food enters the stomach. So when you start eating, right, food goes down and gets in there, you enter the gastric phase. You're going to ramp up the hydrochloric acid production. You're going to produce some various other molecules like acetylcholine and histamine and others that aid digestion. And you're going to increase blood flow to the stomach. Interestingly, when blood flows into the stomach, you think about the stomach, let's say blood's coming in this way, it crisscrosses across the stomach, and then it's going to drain this way. So the stomach's real acidic, right? So it produces a lot of hydrochloric acid, which makes most people think that after the blood, it's kind of logical, that you think that after the blood goes and supplies the stomach and goes out the other side, that it would be more acidic. But in fact, it's the opposite. Blood becomes much more alkaline on the other side, and they call it an alkaline tide. The reason that it becomes more alkaline is because if you'll remember A&P1 chemistry 2nd and 3rd week, which I'm sure you don't, acids are caused by an increase in the concentration of hydrogen ions. So you have to get the hydrogen ions to make hydrochloric acid from somewhere, and you're going to be getting them from your blood. So the blood supply going into the stomach drops off loads of hydrogen ions, which means that its pH goes up. So it becomes more basic by contributing those hydrogen ions here to the stomach. Lastly, you're going to reach the intestinal phase, And this is when you start squirting the product, your stomach's product, into the small intestine. The product of your stomach's digestive roll is called chyme. So chyme is pronounced chyme. And you don't make 3 mils of it, but you squirt about 3 milliliters at a time. So tiny little squirts. You squirt them into the duodenum, the first leg of that small intestine, which we'll get to here shortly. A couple of finishing thoughts. Excuse me. If you start eating and you put roughly about 1.5 liters in there, which is a decent amount, your stomach, you'll get your second wind. You ever thought about that? You know, like at Thanksgiving or something, you'll be like, full, and then like you go, oh, maybe just one more, right? So your stomach undergoes what's called receptive relaxation. It kind of says, you know what, you're eating a lot of food, but then it thinks, well, you're in it for the long haul. You're really serious, so, and that's when you undo your belt and lay back on the recliner. If you eat a normal sized meal that's not really high in fiber, you know, excessively high in fiber, you can empty your stomach in about 4 hours. So some foods digest more quickly, like starches, right? So if you just eat a bunch of white rice, you're gonna clear that out of there pretty fast. If you eat a bunch of, you know, asparagus or broccoli or things that are really fibrous, along with like a mix of proteins and stuff, you're gonna maybe take a little bit longer, but that's a good average. So maybe you shouldn't go swimming for 4 hours after you eat. That's a big myth anyway. That means just don't exert yourself to the point where you get a cramp and then you can't breathe and you drown. It has nothing to do with swimming. All right, let's move into the small intestine. So from the stomach, we move into the small intestine. And if you remember, there are 3 major regions of your small intestine, and I've abbreviated them here. You can go ahead and look them up. Duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. They total about 6 or slightly more than 6 meters in length. So this thing is not quite a meter. A meter would probably be about that long. So 6 of these is coiled up in just your small intestine. It's called small because its diameter is small, not because its length is small. The stuff in your small intestine is called chyme. The whole way through, the name of that material is chyme. And it can spend about 12 hours. So 12 plus 4, so we're up to about 16 hours of time that food spends moving through your body. I'll get to that later if I remember, I hope. Couple of key features of your small intestine: the villi, which are those protrusions that look like this, right? And the villi have those lacteals in them, and they have a capillary bed to absorb other nutrients. Lacteals absorb lipids, and then that's also a big increaser of surface area. And then on the surface of those villi, you've got little extensions of the plasma membrane of each cell, which are called microvilli. Again, another surface area increaser. Peyer's patches. We remember those from the immune system at the very, the immune system, and then now, I guess, digested from lab. Peyer's patches are patches of lymphoid tissue that you'll find only in the ileum, and lymphoid tissue is good for protecting you against bacteria or fungi or whatever, which, as you're located in the ileum, which is the tube closest to the colon, as you'll see, we have loads of bacteria living in our colon that we don't necessarily want to live in our small intestine. So it's kind of like a sentry post or a guardhouse at the rear entrance to your small intestine. A couple of processes that occur here: segmentation and peristalsis. It's hard to really describe segmentation. You can describe peristalsis. If this was my small intestine and I squeezed this end and if there was food in there and I went, and all the food would move in that direction. So circular muscle, as it squeezes the length of a tube, will push that food along. That's how you propel food through your digestive system. Now, segmentation is a little bit different. Imagine instead that my hands represent circular muscle and there's food in between. Well, if I squeeze here, food's going to go there and there, right? So if I squeeze both of these, you're going to pack food in here. But then if I squeeze here and here, it's going to chop up that food. So it's kind of like mixing. It's like mixing the food. You break it up, you mix it around, you break it up, you mix it around, and all of this is to generate exposure to all of the digestive enzymes which we're about to dump into that small intestine. So you really want to get a real good slurry, that's a good word, a real good slurry of chyme. A lot of water in there, right? You probably had liquids with your meal, so you've got this big liquidy mess that's starting to move through your small intestine. Segmentation is chopping up, peristalsis is moving along, and then we'll move along. We'll peristaltically move down to the next panel. Some more glands and their products. You have duodenal glands, which are going to secrete an alkaline mucus. Well, why do I want to secrete an alkaline mucus in my duodenum? Anyone know? You can't answer. Well, I just produced a bunch of acid in my stomach, and so my stomach's built for that. My stomach's built to handle really low pHs, like down around 3 or lower. My intestines are not. The enzymes that function in my intestines don't work that well there. You don't want leakage of too much acid into your intestines, and you only want it leaked out in small amounts, so therefore the alkalinity that you're producing in your intestines can counter that and kind of bring it back up closer to neutral. You have goblet cells which produce mucus. Again, mucus helps stuff slide along. You have these unicellular glands again which produce, these guys produce something called enteropeptidase. So enteropeptidase is an enzyme which activates something called trypsinogen. And we'll see trypsinogen in the next section down here, produced by the pancreas. So enteropeptidase is kind of like the activator for another enzyme that's coming in from another location. So it's kind of like epoxy. If you ever used epoxy, this is not sticky, this is not sticky. I put them together and then they have a new function. Then they undergo a chemical reaction which makes them into glue. This is not a digestive enzyme, and this is not a digestive enzyme, but you put this guy with this guy and this guy becomes a digestive enzyme. There's those enteroendocrine cells, which again I mentioned in the stomach. Those produce paracrines and things that help you function digestively. And then just a little finishing thought here. After that 12 hours or so that it spends, that chyme spends in your small intestine, you absorb about 90% of the water back. So if you drink, 9 liters of water over the course of a day, it's like 2.5 gallons. That's a lot of water. But if you drink, if you drink 1 liter of water, 900 centiliters of that, milliliters, losing it everybody, 900 milliliters of that will have been reabsorbed. So it will be taken out of the lumen of your gut and reabsorbed back into your bloodstream. So you have this your digestive system is not only absorbing nutrients and giving you calories and whatever else, but it's also a big wastewater reclamation facility. You're literally cleansing the water that is in this food that's being processed and putting it back into your system. All right, we move on to the pancreas. Your pancreas is that little feathery looking organ, we've seen it before, that's located just below your stomach, and it feeds into that little duodenal papilla, if you remember, along with the bile duct. So the pancreas, we remember that from the section at the beginning of this semester on hormones, right, on the endocrine system. So it has endocrine function, but it also has a lot of digestive function. So the digestive function of the pancreas is performed by these cells called acinar cells, or acini. So if you just go ACINI, if you see that, it's just a plural for acinar cells. They secrete something pleasantly named pancreatic juice. And pancreatic juice has some various chemicals in it. One I'd already mentioned, trypsinogen. So trypsinogen, when exposed to enteropeptidase, becomes trypsin. Trypsin is a protease. It digests proteins. Trypsin also activates a couple of other pancreatic enzymes, carboxypeptidase and chymotrypsin. All three of these, trypsinogen, carboxypeptidase, chymotrypsin, are all produced by the pancreas, and they only become active once they're out in the duodenum. right? They all digest proteins. So most of your protein digestion is a function of pancreatic juice. But then to show that pancreatic juice is a four-tool player, we've got amylase, lipase, and nucleases, breaking down starches, fats, and nucleic acids, respectively. So of your four major biologically important macromolecules, protein, lipid, carbs, and nucleic acids, pancreatic juice can solve most of those problems. Which is also, for such a small, useless looking little organ, this is why if you get like pancreatic cancer and it's bad, you're not going to make it, because it's an incredibly important thing for getting nutrients. You won't get all, you'll basically starve to death without a pancreas. All right, so now here's where it's kind of out of order. I'm going to go over here to this liver section because it contributes its secretions at the same point as the pancreas, which is at the head of that, the top of that small intestine. So the liver produces bile, which is stored in the gallbladder, and bile, as we learned in the lab, is an emulsifier. Emulsifier means it just takes a big blob of something and breaks it into smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller blobs. If I've got a blob of lipids in a single blob and a blob of lipids in 1,000 blobs, the 1,000 blobs have a lot more surface area. So you've got a lot more exposure of that spread out lipid for the lipases, which you've already seen produced by the pancreas. Remember that the hepatic portal system supplies the liver with blood from the digestive system, and the liver contributes bile that goes back to the digestive system. So it's a two-way street here for this digestive function of the liver. It receives the nutrient-rich blood, and it contributes the fat emulsifying bile. The cells of the liver are called hepatocytes. They're going to do all this stuff. They both process the nutrients that are brought in and produce the bile that goes out to the gallbladder to be stored, and then to the duodenum to function. A couple of things that can go wrong with your liver. Hepatitis is, any liver swelling is hepatitis, but the one that you usually hear is like a viral, right? So you have hepatitis A and B and C, I think. They have different characteristics. But your liver, just like any other organ in your body, can be infected by viruses. Cirrhosis is the damage that you can see to the liver from any number of things. Hepatitis causes cirrhosis, but the most common one that we think of when you think of cirrhosis is from alcohol abuse. So there's lots of hepatotoxic chemicals out there. Alcohol is no exception. In low doses, no big deal. But chronic, long-term overexposure can really work that liver, right? And if you combine that with, other chemicals you may be taking, drugs or whatever, not even like illegal drugs, but like prescribed drugs can sometimes be really harmful for your liver. Acetaminophen is a famous one. If you drink a lot of alcohol, don't eat a lot of Excedrin or Tylenol, right? Go with something a little bit less harmful. So cirrhosis is basically liver damage. You can have other problems, fatty liver and so on. Okay, let's move to the large intestine. At the end of the ileum, by the time we get to the end of the small intestine, the ileum will drop off the chyme. It's still chyme. Drop off the chyme into the large intestine. And we, if you pictured, you do have to know all the parts again. So you have the cecum, which is the entry container. You have that little appendix, which trails the squiggly thing that hangs off of there. Contains lots of lymphoid tissue again. So you have kind of guard houses in the ileum, and also at the beginning of the large intestine. Then you've got the colon, which kind of goes up and over and down, sigmoid shape. Rectum is the little tube on the exit, and then the anus is the very exit. What does the large intestine do? Well, it reabsorbs the remaining water. Your feces should be semi-solid to solid. You don't want diarrhea all the time, right? I'm not telling you anything new here. If you live you live somewhere where you can get clean water and you've got even bad diarrhea, you can sometimes keep up with that by drinking a lot of water, even though you're losing a lot of water, until you get that, whatever it is, cleared up. But if you don't live in a place where pure water or whatever is plentiful, diarrhea can kill you, right? You can die from that. More people have probably died from, more soldiers have died from diarrhea than they have from the enemy, right? It puts the dye in diarrhea. It's not. I'm not really proud of that joke, but there, it's out. You also you can get some ions from your food. So electrolytes that might still be in the chyme get reabsorbed, which are useful. And here's the real thing. Here's the real use of your large intestine. You've got 700 or more species of bacteria, and not just bacteria, but fungi and archaea, which is another type of prokaryote, and other single-celled organisms. You've got loads and loads of these things. You've got, half a pound of bacteria living in your colon, which is kind of weird, right? You've got trillions and trillions of cells. There's more cells of bacteria living in your gut than you have cells of you. So you might be 30 trillion cells. There's more bacteria, but they're just really small, so they don't weigh as much. Some things that these bacteria do, most of them are just what they call commensal. And commensal, I'll write that down. Commensal organisms basically don't hurt you, but they get a benefit, right? So picture maybe a sparrow living under the eave of your house. It gets protection from the rain, and it doesn't hurt you, right? So it gets a benefit, and you don't care, no problem. These bacteria living in your gut are doing the same thing. They're getting all of this low-grade nutrients that you don't use anymore, right? There's lots of fiber. There's lots of low concentrations of nutrients that just made it through your intestine. So they've got this windfall of food that you don't have any use for anymore. So of course they're going to live there, and they call that commensalism. But some of them actually give back, right? Most of them don't, but they're not, they don't hurt you or help you. But some of them actually give back, and the ones that give back are called, these are mutuals, or they exhibit mutualism. And mutualism is this relationship, this symbiotic relationship where I scratch your back, you scratch mine, right? So these guys get a place to live, right? The bacteria that produce these vitamins get a place to live, they get free food brought in, they're protected from dehydration, yada, yada, yada. And then they produce vitamins, K especially, and then one version, I forget, of B, vitamin B, which you then can absorb. You can also get a little bit of carbs. You have we eat what they call insoluble fiber. If you ever looked on the side of your cereal box, it says dietary fiber, right? So dietary fiber includes cellulose, which we mentioned way long ago in ANP1. Cellulose is basically plant fibers that you don't have an enzyme to digest. So those plant fibers pass all the way through. When they're exposed to certain species of bacteria, they can break them down. And in doing so, we can actually get some sugars. Your colon can absorb some sugars. Interestingly, animals that eat a lot more raw, tough vegetation have a lot bigger colon, or a long cecum, or a lot longer large intestine, in that the food, the fiber, the chyme will spend more time in that tube, and they'll be able to get more nutrients out of it, right? We eat a lot of, we're omnivores, so we eat lots of animal products as well as plant products, but we tend to process the plant products a lot more now. We've gotten real technologically advanced, so we don't eat as much fiber. You should eat more fiber. It's good for you. Keep the colon cancer away at the end of your life there. It acts like kind of a scrub brush. The bacteria also produce gases. So in reality, if someone asks who farted and it was you can say, not me, because it was the bacteria. These are bacteria farts. They produce like hydrogen gas, and they produce some sulfides, hydrogen sulfides. Hydrogen sulfides are the ones that stink. They can produce methane. The hydrogen sulfides are the stinky ones, though. So that's the funky stuff. But these are flammable gases, several of them, and take it from me, 12-year-old me found out that they are in fact flammable. There's no bad endings to the story. It's just that I used to do that. Careful down there. Anyway, over the course of the transition through your colon, chyme becomes feces. So the finished product is called feces, and basically that's whatever you don't need. And going back to up here, you better hope you'd reabsorb most of the water out of the rest of the water out of there, because you can dehydrate pretty quickly. Well, I think that's it. I do want to say one thing if you're still here, and it's way off the topic, but in lab, if I ever don't cover something, like if I forget a table towards the end, like I forgot on the reproductive system, you'll see when you get there, you still have to know those tables. So make sure that you are using that book as your main, the lab book as your main lab, requirements, and then my lectures should cover most of that stuff. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Don't forget, I have virtual office hours on Blackboard Collaborate Monday through Thursday from 10 till 12, or by appointment. All right, hope you guys are all taking care of yourselves out there. See you later.